Hello and welcome to today's lecture on the Progressive Era in Washington. This is the second of our lectures looking at the movements of the Progressive Era. I can't convey to you enough how important the Progressive Era is in American history, particularly in American political, social, and economic history, and also labor history, the history of work. The Progressive Era is just so fundamentally important in laying the groundwork for later American political, social, civil rights, labor movements, and so on and so forth. And so, all we can do in these lectures is just kind of give you a little bit of a taste of it, a little bit of a sense of what went on during the Progressive Era, the movements, the groups, the environment which spawned it. Now, to this point, in this particular unit, we've talked about the economic development and economic realities of Washington and the people who lived in Washington. We talked about immigrants and immigration and social composition in Washington and how and tried to broadly give you a sense of the experiences of peoples in Washington. Then we took a step back and looked at the big picture political and economic situation within the United States, which is basically trying to understand what politics was like in the industrial age, even if Washington itself is not an industrialized state, and it really isn't. It's feeling the effects of the industrial economy because its economic industries are mobilized to and contingent upon the greater industrialization of the American economy. And so you have to have an appreciation of industrial politics and political coalitions. And that's going to come up more and more as we go deeper into this unit and the next unit, political coalition. So we'll talk more about this kind of stuff. Then we looked at the general progressive movement sweeping across the country and thinking about the groups who were looking at modern America and seeing both problems and opportunities to resolve those problems. And one of the things that I think that you really need to understand is the progressive era is a really optimistic movement. It's an optimistic movement that says, look, America is transforming, and these transformations are awe-inspiring. You're going from a land that is a land you went from a land that was a land of hand labor and animal labor and covered wagons crossing the Oregon Trail to, by the 1910s, a land that has railroads crisscrossing the country, meaning you can get from Seattle to New York in a matter of days, not months after months. You have electricity, you have streets that are becoming filled with automobiles. Yes, you're still seeing animal carts and the like, but automobiles are becoming a fixture on American city streets in the 1910s. We have telephones. We have the ability to have a phone conversation with between someone in one part of the country to someone in another part of the country. Whereas just 70 years earlier, 60 years earlier, people were relying on letters that took months to reach their destination. So it's been a fantastical transformation of American society and American life. And the progressive reformers looked at that and said, look at what has been achieved in this country in a matter of years, in a matter of decades. Yes, it's come with problems, and the progressive reformers all identified problems, whether it was first wave feminists looking to get women the right to vote and serve in political office, or whether it was African American leaders, Asian American leaders looking at discrimination, prejudice, and hate and saying these things have to be resolved, or it was political reformers looking at corruption in government and saying we have to figure out a way to make government more transparent, more accountable to the democratic public. Whatever the case is, progressive reformers identified problems, but they thought that solutions could be had to those problems. They were optimists, not pessimists. The progressive era is a period of tremendous optimism and a belief in what humans can accomplish, and that human ingenuity, human work, human knowledge could solve problems, that problems were not insurmountable. That's what the Progressive Era is about. So as we're going through all of um, the moments in Washington that lead to the Progressive Era, and then we start going through the Progressive Era reforms, I want you to keep that kind of zeitgeist, that sentiment in the back of your mind, which is that this is a period of tremendous optimism. Okay? All right, let's go through. So, this slide is just to sort of remind you that there are severe economic strains on society. We talked about this in the last lecture, so I don't want to go over this too much, but I do want you to be aware that the economic growth of the late 19th, early 20th century in Washington certainly brought benefits, right? There were technological advancements, infrastructure advancements, people's quality of life got better. Goods were more affordable. The standard of living for most of the country was raised. But there were real strains because people are working primarily in low wage jobs. And those low wage jobs are not providing a living wage. As we talked about in the previous lecture, in the United States around 1900, between 1900 and 1910 or so, it took about $600 a year to cover all your basic costs. Think housing, food, clothing, your basic necessities. And yet your average American worker was probably only making around $500. If you're only making around $500, either you're going without certain things or you're having to make severe accommodations, meaning that you might be you can't afford to rent or own a home or an apartment on your own. You're basically renting a room in someone's apartment, right? Because you just can't afford the rent or a mortgage if you're an owner on your own. Or it means multiple members of the family are working just to scrimp and scrape by, meaning spouses and children. And that was a very common thing among the working class. Poverty is very high. Okay, poverty is very high. Yet there's tremendous amounts of wealth being generated, as we talked about. There are people who are worth tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars in America at this time. People like Andrew Carnegie or James J. Hill or the Vanderbilt family. They're worth incredible amounts of money. Collectively, the wealthiest families in the country, who represent about 1% of the population, are controlling over a third of the wealth generated. They're controlling over a third of the economic activity in the United States. The inequality is real. And by the early 20th century, lots of groups are fed up with it, okay? Lots of groups are fed up with it. And that's not even to mention the dangerous working conditions that you find. So wages are low, working conditions are dangerous, there's enormous economic inequality, poverty is high, and what's largely happening is that people are looking out. They're looking out at the, society as a whole. They're looking at all the benefits of modern life, but they can't afford it. They can't afford it. And so there's a real sense that this economic inequality is unfair. And that will be one of the major contributors to organized labor. And organized labor plays a major role in the Progressive Era. So we're going to talk a little bit about organized labor and progressive reforms in just a moment. But before we do so, we need to talk a little bit about some philosophical and political/economic theories that are pretty pervasive in the late 19th and early 20th century and play a large role in some of the things that we'll be talking about and some of the ideological and policy debates that occur in America, not just in the early 20th century, but for the rest of the 20th century, okay? So, industrialization began in Europe. Britain was the first industrialized nation in the world. It spread to the European continent, then spread to the United States. So at the time when the United States is industrializing, many places in Europe have already industrialized. And with industrialization came intellectual discourse around this new industrial era and understanding economic policy and political ideas during this new time in world history. I'm just going to say this again, and some of you might be tired of me saying this, but I cannot impress upon you enough how industrialization transforms society. It just does. It totally upends society and social hierarchies. Industrialization changed the very nature of work, right? It put out of business craftsmen, people who used to make things by hand, whether it was clothing or things made out of metal or shoes or linens or furniture or machines. Those things used to have to be made by hand by skilled craftsmen. Those craftsmen find themselves put out of work by the factories and the machines housed in the factories that put things out. So a lot of how the economy worked, if you were to go and study, say, Europe before the 1750s, before the 19th century, the Europe you would study would be a lot different than the Europe you would study in the 1800s and into the 20th century, because industrialization has changed the economy and the social hierarchy that existed with respect to that economy. The old economy is gone, and once the old economy is gone, the nature of society changed. Now, ironically, as we've talked about before, but I just want to emphasize again here, industrialization creates the need for more workers than ever because the factories need workers, exploiting the natural resources that feed the industrial economy, and the factories themselves requires more labor. So there's more work than ever, but that work is about being just a body, a warm body. The industrial jobs, by and large, were not skilled jobs. You could learn them relatively quickly, as opposed to, say, being a blacksmith, which took years of apprenticeship to understand how to work metal appropriately and properly to produce the kind of goods that you needed. Industrialization changes that. You don't need that much skill to work in a factory. You need to be trained, but that training takes relatively little time, and then you can work in the factory or you can work in the mines. And by the way, this is not I'm not trying to belittle these jobs or be derogatory about them. Not at all. They're very important jobs then and now. So please don't misunderstand me here. I'm just saying they're different kinds of jobs than what existed before the industrial economy. Okay? They're just different kinds of jobs. That then upended the social system where industrialization took root. It caused enormous dislocation. It caused entire small towns that have been self-sufficient with the local tailor, the local blacksmith, the local craftsman, whatever they might be. Those people suddenly are out of jobs because as long as you can reach an area by railroad or road, you can get factory-made goods into the town. And that put entire towns out of business. It meant that except for agriculture, most towns didn't need anything other than stores and shopkeepers, which meant that you needed business owners as opposed to craftsmen who sold their goods. It's just a different kind of life. This also upended political regimes because political regimes in the pre-industrial world had been designed to exploit the economy and to govern a pre-industrial society economy. So all this just created tremendous change. But as I've said before, it created tremendous opportunity because industrialization did result in a better quality of life and generate a lot of wealth. It's just the question was, how are the benefits of industrialization distributed? Who benefits from it? Is it sort of concentrated in the hands of a wealthy few who own the processes and the factories and the means of production? Or should it be distributed more widely among those who are working and among society as a whole in these areas? So these are kind of the debates. And what should government look like in this industrial society? So these are the kind of debates that happen. And out of these debates come three sort of philosophical systems that are in response to the industrial era: capitalism, socialism, and communism. Now, I'm just going to overview each of these for you. I want to make something abundantly clear to you. I am not going to give a thorough PhD level thesis or dissertation on each of these topics. While I have a certain amount of expertise in each of these topics as a trained European historian, I'm not a I'm not one of the world's leading experts on any of these philosophical systems, just to be clear. And also, it's really not the place of a Pacific Northwest course to go in depth and detail on each of these. However, these ideas are part of a discourse that is happening all over the United States, all over the world, but specifically in Washington. So it's important you have some familiarity with them. So I'm just going to give you the briefest of overviews of each of them. If you care more about these, there are additional courses you can take at most colleges, including this one. You can take classes in more contemporary America where they're going to get a little bit deeper into these ideas. You can also take classes in either modern world history or modern European history, contemporary European history, in which you'll get even deeper into these ideas as well. And then, of course, you're always welcome to read them on your own and read experts who have written commentaries on these ideas. It's worth thinking about them because they really did shape the 20th century and in some ways continue to shape our dialogue in the 21st century. That said, right, I'm just going to give you an overview of each of them, right? So, important to understand these ideas, capitalism, socialism, and communism, are ideas rooted in response to the transformations that industrialization is having on countries, on people, on societies, on economies. It's very important you understand that, okay? So, capitalism is the idea embraced by political leaders in the 19th and early 20th century, so American political leaders, be they at the federal, state, or local level, and it's embraced by business leaders, by business owners, by factory owners, by mine owners, by logging company owners, and so on and so forth, okay? Capitalism is a philosophical system that they have embraced. Now, what capitalism is it's an economic philosophy. It's an economic philosophy that has real political implications. The economy is just the market where we exchange goods and services. It's about how you generate a living. And inevitably, right, thinking about the economy is going to force you to think about what kind of government or political system that you want. So, capitalism is an economic philosophy, right? It has political and government implications depending on how you view it. All right? Now, there are many different types of capitalism. So there is no one kind of capitalist philosophy. There's many different capitalist philosophers and capitalist philosophical systems. There's many different ways to think about capitalism. So this kind of brief overview is really not doing it justice. Nonetheless, in the 19th century, what we tend to have is a laissez-faire capitalist ideology that basically permeates the United States and political leaders and business leaders within the United States. And these are the basic principles that they have embraced. So the first principle you need to understand is the idea of free markets, and related to that is the idea of competition. So capitalism is derived ultimately from the ideas of a guy named Adam Smith. He was a Scottish philosopher. He lived in the 18th century, and he had seen the first phase of industrialization in Britain and began to talk about the merits of it, and not just the merits of it, but what made it work. And then what happened is throughout the 19th century, various thinkers in the West, in Europe and the United States, then expanded upon Smith's ideas. And ultimately, by the time we get to the time period we're talking about, laissez-faire capitalism is what most people have embraced. So the basic idea here is that the seat of economic development, the seat of economic innovation is the market, right? And the market is just a general term. It doesn't have to be a physical location, although it might be. It might be the farmer's market where you go and you buy and sell food items or foodstuffs. But it might also just be a general term for like grocery stores or a general term for, you know, the buying and selling of steel. The market is not necessarily a place, it's a concept. And the concept is the market is where people go to buy and sell goods. Okay? Now, when people go to buy and sell goods, ultimately you can write rules for how the market should function. You could write rules saying that prices can't be above or below a certain level. Or you can set rules limiting who can be in the market and sell. You can set all kind of rules you want about the market. And ultimately that's the role of government, right? Government can come in and say, well, yes, the market where people buy and sell goods, the concept of it. It exists. Here it is, and here are the rules for how the market should work. Or government can say there are no rules, right? A government that says there are no rules to the market, or very, very few rules to the market, is what economists call a free market. It's free of rules, laws, regulations. That's what the term means, a free market, free from regulations and restrictions by law or policy, so on and so forth. Okay? Now, in the late 19th and early 20th century, the time period we're talking about, most capitalists were what we call free market capitalists. Free market capitalists. They were free market capitalists. Okay? What that meant is that they believed quite strongly in the free market, a market free from government interference and government regulation. Now, why did they want that? They said because it's the best way to ensure competition. Competition ensured innovation because as people competed against one another in the market, they would compete to make sure their goods were cheaper or their goods were better or their goods were more effective or whatever. And that competition created improvement, it created technological innovation, and that innovation was good for society as a whole. Competition was good and you only got competition from free markets. But why would people bother competing? Well, according to this theory, is people are inherently selfish. They're driven by self-interest. They want to make as much money as possible. They want to control as much of the market as possible, which means they're going to competitively try and be better, cheaper, more efficient, more durable, whatever, than their competitors. People are going to compete to have the best steel, or the best railroads, or the best clothing. Take your pick. That's what the theory says. They're going to compete because the consumers, the people who buy things, they're going to be interested in essentially trying to get to the consumers are going to be interested in trying their hardest to get to the best item for the best value for their money. They're going to try and buy what's either the most affordable or some combination of affordable and quality. But whatever the case is, consumers are going to gravitate towards the better product, however they define better, and that's going to create competition. And competition creates innovation. And that innovation benefits everyone. So what capitalists said is that competition created industrialization. And mass production drove the cost of goods low. So all of this has been good, according to their theory. Okay? People are selfish and self-interested. They want to make as much money as possible, and a free market exploits their self-interest for the benefit of everyone else. Adam Smith, in his writings on The Wealth of Nations, referred to this as the invisible hand of the market raising everyone up, driven by people's selfishness. Now, according to this theory, you could not get this if markets were regulated. So you need to have totally markets in an economy that's free from government interference. And government interference, according to the system, was defined by regulation, by laws, by the things that happened. Okay, but the policies government made. This is known as laissez-faire. Laissez-faire is just a French term that means leave it alone in order for it to create. The market will only function if you leave it alone. And 19th and early 20th century capitalist thinkers embraced ideas of social Darwinism, this idea that it was survival of the fittest in the market, and those who were worthy would survive and thrive. There was kind of a social Darwinistic element to this. Now, some of you listening to this might think, yeah, this totally makes sense to me. And some of you might be thinking, well, it sounds utopic and good in theory, but there are real problems. And there are real problems with this system, right? In particular, this system allows wealthy individuals to leverage their wealth to basically drive out competition. It allows for monopolies to keep others from entering the market. And without that competition in the market, what kind of innovation do you get? How do consumers and the general public benefit, right? There are legitimate issues with this system. There are also legitimate innovations that came from this system. But by and large, this was the ideology embraced by the wealthy and the political and business elite in the country. But there were responses to this. And in Europe, and then making its way to America, one response to this was socialism. One response to this was socialism. Now, socialism is a really, really misunderstood ideology and term. In modern political discourse, it's often used as a smear or an insult or as a way to marginalize or belittle or critique certain individuals arguing for certain policies. So it's really, really misunderstood. And part of the reasons it's misunderstood is there is no one kind of socialism. There is, socialism, much like capitalism, much like any philosophy, has different branches and aspects to it. So it's not as if there's one kind of socialism. But by and large, in the 19th century, socialism emerged as a critique and an alternative to what socialist thinkers saw as the extravagances and the exploitation of capitalism. What socialists basically argued is that capitalism worked quite well for those who controlled the resources, who had the wealth, who had the land, who owned the businesses. But it didn't work so well for the workers. Now, capitalists would argue, well, the workers just needed to work harder. And if they did so, they would rise through the ranks, and in doing so, enjoy more broadly speaking the benefits of the market. But socialists argued that the system was stacked against people, that the low wages by the workers meant that they were never going to get ahead, and that the wealth generated by capitalism, by the elite in this capitalistic free market system, that wealth disproportionately gave advantages to wealthy people. For example, working class individuals could not afford to send their kids to school. There's really not much of a public education in the 19th and 20th century. The ideas of it are starting, and certain places in the United States have the starts of public education systems. Places in Europe have the start of the public education system. The public education system is not widely available, and it's not widely developed in either Europe or North America. And so that means most schooling is private schooling. You have to pay for it. And the wealthy people could pay to have their children have the best education in the world. Having that education meant that they were more likely to end up in jobs or to innovate and develop technologies and systems that will perpetuate their wealth. By contrast, workers can't even afford the basic necessities in life, let alone to send their kids to school. I mean, it was considered that the wealth brought such an advantage that it perpetuated inequality and class distinctions. And then socialists turned around and argued that while wealthy individuals might own the means of production and the businesses, it was the labor of workers that was actually generating the wealth. And without the workers, the wealth wouldn't be possible. And so that's the crux of the socialist response to the industrial era and capitalistic philosophy. This idea that the wealth generated by these industries, by this new economy, needs to be more widely shared, and that people need access to the resources and necessities of life. So that's the basic criticism that socialism makes of capitalism. That the wealth that is generated needs to be more widely distributed, particularly to those who are generating the wealth through their work and labor, and that people are entitled to basic resources and necessities to make their life possible. So once you make that criticism, the next step is, well, how do you achieve that? Well, that's where socialism becomes varied and diverse in its thinking. Some socialist thinkers were utopic, meaning that they didn't think that socialist ideas of of wealth sharing, of wealth distribution, of collective access to resources and goods, they didn't think that that was a template that would broadly work for a country. It would only work on a small scale. And so these utopic thinkers would try and create these utopian socialist communities where they'd go out and buy a bunch of land, and they would collectively work the land, work the economy, and share the profits of the land, and make decisions collectively and communally about all sorts of things, from the town planning to the shared to economic industries to the distribution of resources. They would make this all together, and these were kind of utopic communities. And you see them crop up all over Europe and the United States, where people begin to sort of just like collectively go together, and they collectively buy land or businesses or whatever, and then they share the profits and they make decisions collectively. And in fact, the Pacific Northwest as a whole, including Washington, was known for having a lot of these utopic communities here, these utopic socialist communities here. So this is an important strain of socialism that gains traction in the US. However, there were other socialist thinkers who believed that these utopic communities might be a small scale local solution to inequality and exploitation, but they weren't broadly speaking um, solutions that would serve a country. And so increasingly within socialist circles, there's a belief that government must play a role in regulating the excess of capitalism. Now, from there, you get multiple views on how this should work. Some people just want strong government regulation. That's what some socialist thinkers just want. Laws and policies regulating the economy, regulating work, regulating industries, so that workers get a better working environment, B, a larger share of the wealth generated by the economy, and C, right? So that exploitation and the excesses of capitalism are reined in from their point of view. From their point of view. Now, there are other socialist thinkers that want to go further and are calling for widespread government ownership of key resources or key industries within the economy, and that then those things should those jobs and work and ownership of those things should be collectively redistributed to the people. That's one socialist thinker. So there's lots of socialist thinking, set of thoughts. So there's a wide view of what socialism represents, but socialism begins to inform the thinking of a lot of workers and organized labor. The last of these ideas is one that most people have heard of, but have never really studied or understood, and that is communism. Okay, And people tend to think of communism and socialism as interchangeable. They're not, they're different. But they do have a relationship in that communism is born out of some of the debates that the early socialist thinkers had, because the inventor of communism, Karl Marx, admired the spirit of early socialist thinkers, even if he didn't agree with their ideas. So let's talk about communism. Communism is an idea, originates in a book called The Communist Manifesto, which was first published in 1848 by a guy named Karl Marx. It's also attributed to someone called Frederick Engels. Engels was the son of a wealthy factory owner, and he funded Marx's work throughout his career. But most scholars don't believe that Engels had much influence on the ideas, that this is Marx's theory. It's just that he always credited Engels as a co-author because of his financial benefit so that Marx could write and work on his ideas. Now, the Communist Manifesto will be revised and republished all throughout the 19th century, so it will have multiple editions, but it was first published in 1848. Now, Karl Marx was a German philosophy professor. He had a PhD in philosophy, although he never could be a professor at a German university because Marx was an atheist. And in Germany at the time, you could not hold a faculty teaching position at a university if you were an atheist. So Marx spends most of his life as a writer and a journalist and a labor organizer, even though he's got this PhD in philosophy. The Communist Manifesto, Marx's theories are really a theory of history. One of the things that's commonly misunderstood about the Communist Manifesto is people believe it's some sort of like rule book or plan that ultimately culminated in the Soviet Union and communist China and all the various communist regimes you would see in the 20th century up to this day. But it isn't. It isn't that way at all. The Communist Manifesto is a prediction for the future that it believes is just manifestly going to happen because of the course of economic development in history. And so it's an attempt to identify the problems of capitalism and then ultimately predict what the solutions will be in very broad terms. Now, communism, like all these philosophies we'll talk about, will then be taken by other thinkers and developed. And the kind of communism most people are familiar with, the kind that emerged in the Soviet Union and later China, is called Leninism. It's Lenin's take on this. And we're not going to get into that in this particular class, but it is important to sort of know that there are offshoots of communism, and everything that we've ever seen in the 20th to 21st century is an offshoot. It's not a pure implementation of Marx's ideas, whatever you think of them. So the basis for Karl Marx's communism is a theory of history. Marx has this theory of history that animates his entire philosophy. And that theory of history is this, that the theory of history is class struggle. That history, while the names change, what you really have is class struggle between the lower classes and the wealthy political and economic elites. And that the history of humanity is a class struggle between those who control resources and those who don't. And that government and religion are simply tools developed by elites to oppress the masses and rationalize and justify their exploitation of the resources and the masses who work those resources for the wealthy elite. And what Marx argues is that over history, the names have changed, right? You might, in the medieval period, you called it, lord and serf. In the Roman period, you called it patrician versus plebeian. He says in the 19th century, you called it the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat. And the proletariat is Marx's term for the industrial working class. But regardless, it's a cycle of class struggle. And he says what happens throughout history, this is Marx's theory. I'm not saying it's correct. In fact, historians don't view it as correct. But Marx's theory is this, is that what you have happen is you have the ruling class and the lower classes. And what happens is out of the lower classes come kind of a middle class, and they envy the wealth and privileges and power of the ruling class. So they stir up revolt. That revolt topples the ruling class. This middle class then asserts itself as the new ruling class and promptly oppresses the oppressed class again. And that's the cycle of history. That's that class struggle. But Marx says industrialization has changed the game. Modern technology has meant that the poor classes, the exploited classes, the workers, whom he calls the proletariat, that group is now aware of the cycle of history. They're what Marx calls class conscious. They're aware and they're interconnected. And so what's going to happen is that the forces of capitalism, which Marx calls the bourgeoisie, they are going to end this cycle. They're going to rise up, overthrow the elites. But this time, they're not going to exploit others because they are class conscious, they're aware of the cycle of history, and they refuse to perpetuate oppression. So they're going to rise up. And in doing so, they will end class struggle, end social classes, and create a kind of utopic egalitarian existence. That's what Marx argues. Okay? Now, he says that the vanguard leaders of the revolution will be the communists, which is where this term comes from. They're going to lead the workers to this revolution, which will then bring about all the benefits of industrial society without the exploitation of industrial society. That's Marx's argument, okay? So Marx is a critic of industrialization, but not of the technology and the innovation. Marx himself is a futurist. He really likes all the new benefits of society. But what he doesn't like is what he believes is the exploitation due to capitalism. That's what he wants to destroy. And that's what he thinks the communist revolution will do. So what Marx argues is that communism is revolutionary. There will be a revolution, and Marx believes that it's likely to be a violent revolution, although he doesn't say it has to be. He just thinks that history shows it'll be a violent revolution. And when the revolution happens, then the workers, the proletariat, will create a classless society, meaning all social classes will disappear. There will be no need for government, because government was just a tool to exploit the masses. When exploitation is gone, government is gone. And so communism is traditionally associated with like totalitarian governments because that's the expression we've seen in the 20th and 21st century. But in reality, communism believes it's anarchistic. It believes in a kind of anarchy, that there should be no government because government was just a tool to oppress. When oppression is gone, you don't need that tool anymore. Marx believes that this will be an atheistic society because religion is nothing more than a myth for Marx that was invented to control people, to work hand in hand with government, and that you will have an economy based on collective ownership and socialist principles. Everyone will collectively own the means of production, and thus everyone will get distributed to them what they need to survive and for their family to survive. So that's Marx's view of where things are going because of what will happen with the workers and their eventual rising up. Then the question became, for later thinkers, well, how do you achieve this? And that's what later communism is about, is trying to achieve Marx's vision and usher it along. And that's where all the other branches of communism sort of come in. That's a pretty simplistic view of this, but it's basically in a nutshell. So, thinking about those ideological debates and those ideological parameters about the economy and then government's relationship with the economy helps you understand one of the important aspects of late 19th and early 20th century history and one of the important components of the progressive era, which are unions, organized labor. Okay? So, organized labor is simply workers gathering together, organizing, and creating unions. Unions of workers right? Unions of workers who are banding together to try and prevent and push back against dangerous working conditions, low pay, and what they perceive as exploitation. Okay? Organized labor in America has its origins in the 1860s. This is where as the United States starts to industrialize, workers begin to band together to try and collectively resist what they see as unfair conditions and exploitation. And so, wherever the industrial economy or the aspects of the industrial economy, like logging and mining and so on and so forth, wherever those manifest themselves, very quickly you get the development of unions. And by the 1880s, there are unions in Washington state, mostly in the timber and the mining industry. Now, the union movement in Washington initially tends to be quite small and consist of what are called trade unions. And trade unions are just, if you belong to a particular trade like logging or mining, then those are the kind of unions we tend to get here, right? Local trade unions. And the unions tend to be local. And what I mean by that is the unions are just local workers either in a particular town or city, or maybe just specifically at a place of business, like a sawmill. But they're local, okay? They're local unions. Now, the big development in American labor history, in union history, in the late 19th century and into the 20th century is the development of large national unions. Meaning what they're doing is they're taking these local unions and these trade unions and organizing them so they have connections with one another into national unions, okay? And by the 20th century, there are a couple different very, very large unions, and two of them end up really prominent in Washington. So the first of these is called the AFL, the American Federation of Labor. It's really the first big national labor movement, uniting unions from lots of different industries, lots of different trades, and then lots of local unions to band together into one large group. And the theory behind this is the bigger the group, the more leverage that they have, okay? And before we start thinking about the AFL, which is a really big union, and the IWW, the International Workers of the World, which is another really big union, smaller than the AFL, but a really big union based out of Chicago that ends up in Washington. These are the two big national unions that have the most traction and membership in Washington. But before we begin to sort of like think about these big unions and their activities here and what makes them different, I think we need to talk about just unions as a whole, right? The concept of a union is pretty simple. Workers at a place of business or in a trade band together. They join this. They belong to it, okay? Now, their goal is to prevent exploitation, to get better wages, and to get better working conditions for their workers. Now, keep in mind, they don't have a lot of levers of power because the business is owned by someone else. The means of production are owned by someone else. The wealth generated by these businesses and production goes to someone else, the business owners. So the wealth is on the other side of the equation, right? How is it that they're going to get the business owners, the production owners, to concede to their demands, whether it's better pay, safer working conditions, better hours, whatever it is that they want? Well, they don't have a lot of tools to get that. The only tools that they have are essentially their work. And so that's what they leverage. They can say, well, we want better pay. If we don't get better pay, we'll stop working or we'll slow down. They might just all of a sudden just do a slowdown where they're slowing their work to the point where they're cutting their production in half, and that hurts the bottom line. Or if it gets bad enough, they refuse to work, which is called a strike. They're leveraging their labor collectively to try and get concessions from businesses, from production owners. Now, production owners are ultimately going to have to respond to that, and there are multiple ways that they could, but that's the general theory. That's the general idea, okay? And so when you build national unions, you're basically mobilizing workers not in a small town or in a particular industry, but you're saying, no, we're a nationwide movement. We're workers banding together. And that collective power could theoretically ultimately force them to get concessions from the big corporations, the trusts, the monopolies that control the American economy. So that's kind of the theory behind this. All right, so how about the two large unions in Washington, right? The two large national unions in Washington, the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, and the IWW, the International Workers of the World. They're two large national unions. They're not the only two, but they're the two most prominent in Washington, so that's where we're going to focus our attention. They're very, very different unions. The AFL, which in the late 19th century is headed by a guy named Samuel Gompers, the AFL is pro-capitalism. It's not really interested in government regulation. It's not really interested in government policy. What they just want is a larger share of the capitalist pie given to workers. And so what they want is businesses and wealthy individuals who own these businesses to just concede to giving more money and better working conditions and so on and so forth to workers. But they're not really interested in strong government regulation. They're not really interested in government ownership of industries. They are very much in favor of the capitalist system. They just want workers to get a bigger share of the capitalist system. So that's the AFL. Also, the AFL is virulently anti-immigrant. The AFL were virulently anti-immigrant. They organized tremendously against immigration, but particularly immigrants from Asia. They were some of the most racist organizers against immigrants from China and people of Chinese heritage. The AFL very often prevented people of color from joining their ranks and certain immigrants from joining their ranks. So they were very, very anti-immigrant and had very, very racist views in a lot of ways. Now, the other big union here, the IWW, it's newer than the AFL. The AFL has its origins in the late 19th century. The IWW comes around in 1905, founded in Chicago. So it's called the International Workers of the World. It certainly has ties to international labor movements, but it's very much a U.S. based movement. Okay, now the IWW is a more radical union than the AFL. By the way, the IWW has a nickname called the Wobblies. So if you ever read documents where they refer to the Wobblies, that's the IWW. No one is exactly sure where this nickname comes from. They're just not. No one is entirely certain where the Wobbly nickname comes from. It might have some racist origins, but no one is entirely certain. But it just becomes one of the terms that they're known by. But the IWW is a more radical union. It tends to be informed by socialism, but particularly communist movements. And the IWW will support socialist and communist movements throughout the country and throughout the world. So it's a much more radical union compared to the AFL, right? They want whole-scale change in the system. The AFL doesn't. The AFL just wants the system to more benefit the workers, but the IWW wants to basically overthrow the system, right? That's their goal. And by 1910, there are lots of unions, and both of these big national unions are present in this state. So we now have unions in the state. That means that Washington begins to experience the kind of labor conflict and labor turmoil that was common in the rest of the United States in the 19th and early 20th century. Historians often refer to this as the labor wars, but and some students, when they first encounter this, say, my gosh, labor wars, seriously? But actually, it's a pretty accurate term, because what you had was business owners and factory owners and trust owners, monopoly owners, who looked at organized workers and saw it as a threat to their market share, to their wealth, to their profits, to their business itself. And most business owners, particularly large trusts, actively tried to discourage the formation of unions. Now, today that's illegal. Every worker has a right to organize a union. You can't stop that, right? Um, there are some states that have developed laws that make it hard to union organize, but you can't stop unions from organizing today. No such law existed in the late 19th and early 20th century. So businesses tried hard to prevent the formation of unions. They did so in ways that were just cruel, like firing anyone who joined a union or tried to organize one. And sometimes they did it in ways that were blatantly illegal and violent, which is they would hire um, kind of thugs and local tough guys to go and intimidate and beat up and threaten and even murder anyone who tried to create unions or join unions. And the same was true on both sides. As business owners and industry owners and local governments tried to oppose unions, workers fought back with their own violence. And violence got even worse when strikes happened because, as I told you earlier, unions have limited levers, right? And strike is one of their biggest levers of power. So they go on strike and they refuse to work until their demands are met. Well, the way in which a business can refuse to meet those demands is simply to keep working and hire people to replace those workers, called replacement workers. Now, unions refer to these workers by a derogatory term called scabs. Anyone who broke the strike and crossed the lines was a scab. And so what unions would do is they create these picket lines around businesses to not just demonstrate that they weren't working, but to keep scab workers or replacement workers from getting in. And so this often created a situation of violence. And then the businesses could retaliate by hiring individuals to try and break up the strike. And very often, strikes turned into public brawls, complete with guns and billy clubs. It was a brutal and bloody affair in which business owners were aggressive in using intimidation and termination, but unions weren't going to take those things standing down. They weren't going to just be beaten for their right to strike. They were going to fight back. And these things became very, very bloody and very, very violent very, very quickly. And then in the next lecture, we'll get into some very specific episodes in Washington in which you will understand and see the violence. Now, in general, federal, state, and local government favored business owners, and local law enforcement would work to break up union activity. In fact, in other places in the United States, federal troops were mobilized to break up union activity. In places like Washington, local police and local sheriffs were often used to break up union activity. So government often sided with the businesses. And in part, that's because of political corruption. A lot of government officials owed their entire public careers to donations from wealthy business owners. And many government officials were taking bribes from business owners. Government corruption was a major, major issue in the 19th and early 20th century. So governments at all levels tended to favor business owners. Public opinion tended to also be against unions in the labor movement, okay? Public opinion tended to be against labor movement as a whole. But beginning the 20th century, that starts to change. And in Washington, the public was, in general, much more sympathetic to unions than you found in much of the rest of the country. So Washington, in some ways, was bucking that trend. All right. So now that we understand the environment, we spent a lot of time trying to get to this point, right? Whether it was discussing politics in the industrial age, whether it was discussing who the progressive reformers were and what they wanted, and then thinking about the conditions on the ground in Washington. We've spent a lot of buildup now getting to the progressive era. So that's what we're going to wrap this lecture up, is thinking about the progressive era, but specifically the government and political reforms that are associated with the Progressive Era. So the Progressive Movement is a term that historians use to describe the period roughly 1900 to 1920, but very specifically like 1900 to 19, say 17, 18, this 2 decade period in which you have the enormous optimism and faith in human capability of the age, powered by a society that wants to address the changes wrought by industrialization, and also a belief that the industrial era is going to require government to change how its relationship with citizens. So, what you effectively have is the forces of reform and change kind of coalescing, okay? They're coalescing. And there's this belief that reform is not just possible, it's inevitable and has to happen. And the Progressive Era kind of describes not just that spirit, but those actual reforms. Now, much of what we're going to talk about from here on out is the political reforms, government policies, laws, constitutional changes that happened as a consequence of the Progressive Era. The reason we're going to talk about those things is that this is what the Progressive Era the Progressive Era is focused on government. In the 19th century, government, informed by capitalist notions of laissez-faire and free market, basically saw its role as only providing law and order, stability, and protection of borders. That's about it. Occasionally, government saw its role as maybe helping with infrastructure projects like railroads and ports, but for the most part, government saw its role as law and order and national security, and that was it. But as we've gone through all of the events that we've been talking about over these last several lectures, even among ardent capitalists, there was a sense that government needed to step in and provide some sort of structure, guidance on many of these issues. And in doing so, this is rethinking the traditional role of government. There's a general belief during the Progressive Era that government has a responsibility to its citizens that goes beyond basic law and order and national security. That in big questions about the economy, about public policy, about society, about work, about all sorts of things, that government must play a role in these conversations, that government must be more responsive to the problems facing society, that the market itself wasn't going to solve all of them. Even among the most ardent capitalists, there was beginning to be a belief that government's role must change in this new industrial era. Now, as we talked about in a previous lecture, and I'm not going to reiterate it now, I just want to remind you, the progressive reformers were a pretty diverse group of people. You had first wave feminists who wanted women's suffrage, and they wanted women to have more political power and political voice. You had the temperance movement, those who believed that society's evils revolved around alcohol and addiction. You had those who were fighting for racial justice. They believed that racial inequality was central to America's woes. So there were civil rights groups, whether it was the NAACP or various groups representing the immigrant communities from Asia or Jewish immigrant communities. But these were civil rights groups. You had unions and economic activists who believed that workplaces were unsafe, were exploitative, and that monopolies and trusts were bad. You had government reformers, people who believed that government was corrupt and that the root of society's problems was a government that was corrupt, beholden to wealthy people and wealthy businesses, and was not willing to respond because of that corruption to society's challenges. So you had a whole host of groups right? As part of the progressive era, each with their own ideas, each with their own agenda. And then layered onto that, you had the political parties, the Democrats and the Republicans. And one of the things that is very challenging for students of history today is to understand that the Democrats and the Republicans in the early 20th century are not the Democrats and the Republicans today, although there are some echoes. A political party is not just a set of ideologies, it's the coalition of people that they get their votes from, who support them. And as we talked about in the industrial politics lecture, the coalitions of the parties were quite a bit different in many ways than they are today. Democrats were strong in the South. They were strong with the white supremacist segregationists in the South. However, in the North, they were strong with immigrants and workers. By contrast, Republicans tended to be the party of big business. They tended to be the party of the WASP. They tended to be anti-immigrant nativists, and they were the party of free market capitalists. However, Republicans also tended to be the party of technological progress. And many Republicans were believers in the role of government, right? And so while the Republican coalition was made up a lot of big business people, there was a reform caucus within the Republican Party. At the same time, even though the Democratic Party was the party of immigrants and workers, it was also the party of the white supremacist South, which was virulently racist and anti-immigrant. And so you had these tensions within the coalition that meant that the coalitions were big tents that could be exploited by, it had different factions within it and could be exploited at different levels by different politicians. And so that kind of nuance and complexity is important for you to understand, because in order to get a lot of these changes of the progressive era, right, these activists that we've talked about before need to take their activism, turn it into votes, and turn those votes into a coalition for one party or the other around certain ideas to get progress on these issues. It doesn't matter what you care about. It matters in a democracy. It matters how you can mobilize what you care about to get votes to then get it done in government, whether it's federal, state, or local. Coalition building is how you do that. And so what you have happen in the early 20th century is progressive reformers begin to reach out to one another and then reach out to political parties to try and figure out how to build coalitions and get this work done. Okay? It really begins with the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt. You can see him on the right. He's generally considered to be the first progressive president of this era, the first reform president of this era. Now, he is a Republican. Teddy Roosevelt came to the presidency not by election, but he was the vice president of William McKinley. And McKinley was assassinated in 1900, shortly after his re-election. Now, Roosevelt was a national figure. He'd been a war hero, had been very famous during the Spanish-American War. He was a very recognizable person. McKinley had been the president during the Spanish-American War. And McKinley chose Roosevelt as his vice president. And they were elected collectively in 1900. McKinley was assassinated shortly after that election. And Roosevelt assumed the presidency. And Roosevelt came from the reform wing of the Republican Party. McKinley, not. Had McKinley never been assassinated, we certainly wouldn't have seen the progressive era reform start so early. But Roosevelt himself was from the reform wing of the Republican Party. And so Roosevelt began to embrace aspects of the progressive movement. And so he's generally considered to be the first progressive president, okay? Now, please keep in mind that Roosevelt himself was a moderate reformer. His sympathies lay with the business owners. In fact, he was great friends with many of the trust owners, like James J. Hill. So his sympathies lay with the trust and the business owners, but he thought that a lot of these economic issues were unsustainable long term. That ultimately these things had to be addressed, and so as a consequence, Roosevelt began using laws on the books to begin to um, try and rein in the excesses of capitalism. But Roosevelt often gets too much credit, mostly due to his own propaganda, for being a progressive reformer. He was a tepid reformer, but nonetheless, he starts the movement. The other thing to understand about Roosevelt is that Roosevelt was an ardent imperialist, and while he had sympathies for African Americans and their plight in the South, he was an ardent racist by our um, standards. And as a consequence, right, the civil rights activists of the civil rights movement, or excuse me, of the progressive era movement, are not going to see much traction under Roosevelt, right? Roosevelt is going to embrace a certain view of the progressive movement. But Roosevelt starts the era. The era then continues and gets its biggest traction under the presidency of Woodrow Wilson, which Wilson's elected in 1912 and reelected in 1916. Now, if this were a U.S. History 2 class, we go into the intricacies of those two presidencies and what happens, but we're not going to do that in this class. What we're going to do is overall look at the reforms so you understand how they change America, and then we'll look at some reforms that are specific to Washington. Because it's important to note that, yes, federal reforms are important, and the federal government's very important, but states and local governments have autonomy themselves to do things within certain aspects of the law that the federal government won't do or hasn't done. And so you need to balance those two things out. So we need to think about the national reforms of the progressive era, but also the Washington only reforms. All right, so let's think about these. So considered the first progressive reform is actually a law that was passed in 1890, but wasn't enforced until the Roosevelt administration, and that is the Sherman Antitrust Act. Trusts were monopolies. They were entities that the wealthy put their businesses into that allowed them to control the economy, right? And so a trust was a symbol of the economic inequality and the wealth and the monopolies and the exploitation that big business owners had. And trusts were actually unpopular with the public, hence Congress passed, and it was signed into law in 1890, the Sherman Antitrust Act. And this act allowed the federal government to break up trusts, said you could break up monopolies. Problem is, no one enforced it until Teddy Roosevelt began to break up trusts during his presidency. So after 1901, and then after he was reelected, or he was elected to his own term in 1904. So Roosevelt gets this reputation as the trust buster because he's the first person to enforce this. Roosevelt himself didn't break up many trusts because, as I said, his sympathies lay with the trust owners, but he did believe the most egregious of the trusts needed to be broken up because public sentiment was so strongly against them. Roosevelt also championed the creation of the Department of Labor and Commerce, a cabinet-level position in the executive branch under the president's authority to basically have the ability to look at, collect data, and intervene in labor disputes. It's called the Department of Labor and Commerce, created in 1903. And Roosevelt did champion that. And so for the first time ever, the federal government has an institution looking at the economy and looking at organized labor. Roosevelt himself doesn't use it on behalf of workers, hardly at all, but it will be the basis for helping workers throughout the 20th century. It's an important reform. Roosevelt's true passion was in conservation, and Roosevelt himself was most interested in conserving parks and wildlife and forest lands that he saw as rapidly disappearing during this industrial age and this industrial development. So Roosevelt was most interested in this. And so he will add millions upon millions of acres to the national forest system and and create new national parks, including in Washington, right? Olympic National Park and North Cascades National Park. Those are Roosevelt era creations or created based on the groundwork of Roosevelt. So Roosevelt will add a lot of land to the public lands. He will also create the United States Forest Service. This was largely in response to a massive fire that broke out in the Pacific Northwest that just burned and burned and burned and burned. And it happened in forest land owned by the federal government, but there was no way to address this. And so the U.S. Forest Service was actually created in response to that fire that happened in 1903 and then in 1904. So Roosevelt began this spirit of reform, and Roosevelt was a popular president, which indicated that on a certain level these reforms were popular. Washington State voted for Roosevelt. In fact, in 1904, they voted for Roosevelt. They will again in 1912 when Roosevelt runs as a third party candidate. So Washington itself is clearly supporting these reform movements and voting for a reform-minded president. Now, Roosevelt leaves office in he doesn't run for office in 1908. There was nothing preventing him from doing so, but he had almost served 2 full terms. The tradition in the United States at the time was not to exceed the presidency of George Washington, even though there was no constitutional restriction to do so. And since Roosevelt had basically served 2 terms because he had become president so early in the second term of McKinley, he decided not to run. Well, in 1908, his attorney general, a guy named William Howard Taft, ran for president and won. And Taft was a traditional Republican, not from the reform wing of the party. And so national reforms basically stopped between 1908 and between 1909 and 1913 during the Taft presidency. That's very unpopular with the general public. And so in 1912, the election is really about progressive reforms. And you have the Democratic candidate, Woodrow Wilson, who's promising a much more sweeping view of progressive reforms. You have William Howard Taft running for re-election, promising basically traditional Republican leadership. And then you have Theodore Roosevelt, who mounts a third-party campaign. He creates a party called the Progressive Party, often called the Bull Moose Party, after his nickname, that he's like a bull moose in a china shop. And so Roosevelt runs a third-party campaign. And so what you have is 2 of the 3 parties are pushing progressive reforms. Roosevelt, more of his moderate reforms, Wilson pushing more sweeping reforms, and Taft offering really nothing in the way of reform. Washington State votes for Roosevelt, but overall Wilson wins the election, and you're going to get and Democrats have enough of a strength in Congress that you're going to get a lot more reforms happening. And so the bulk of the progressive reforms happen under the Wilson administration. We're just going to talk about a few of them. The first 2 I want to address are constitutional amendments. Now, constitutional amendments are very, very hard to get. They require 2/3 proposal from both houses of Congress and then 3/4 of states to ratify them. So you need 2/3 of Congress and then 3/4 of the states. That's a very high bar to reach. It's very hard to do it. In 1913, we get 2 constitutional amendments. That's pretty impressive. The first one is the 16th Amendment. The 16th Amendment is about income tax. It establishes an income tax. Under the original Constitution, income taxes were considered unconstitutional. The 16th Amendment changes that. It provides for the ability for the federal government to set and collect an income tax. This was important because the federal government's going to see its role in basically trying to provide more services, but you need income for services. So this tax, the ability to collect it, is really important. The 17th Amendment is about political reform. It's the direct election of U.S. senators. Under the original Constitution, the election of senators was done by state legislatures. So state legislatures would appoint the U.S. senators, which meant that whoever controlled the state legislature or whatever special interests, i.e. wealthy people could buy off the votes of the state legislature, would get who they wanted in the United States Senate. And of course, the United States Senate is the upper chamber of Congress. it has more power and authority than the House of Representatives does. And so the fact that the people of the country couldn't directly elect their senators was seen as a major target for political reformers so that they could get other reforms that they wanted. They do so with the 17th Amendment. Direct election of U.S. senators becomes possible. The same year, the United States establishes the Federal Reserve System, our central banking system, designed to help regulate the United States' banking system and to help interject American government policy into the economy indirectly through interest rates and monetary policy. We'll talk more about the Federal Reserve System later in this class, but it's established during the Progressive Era. You also get the Child Labor Act of 1914. This is an act designed to limit some forms of child labor and ban child labor for the youngest children altogether. This was a major goal of unions because children were often paid a quarter of what an adult was paid for a job. So if you get children out of the labor market, then adults could earn more money. And it was also something that workers wanted because, of course, their children were working in dangerous environments and no parent wanted to see that. And so this was a major victory for progressive reformers. Now, it will lead to other victories because once the children are out of work but their parents are working, you need somewhere for them to be. And ultimately, this will coalesce around the public school system. So we'll talk about that a little bit later on. You also get the Federal Trade Commission in 1914, known as the FTC. The FTC is about looking at business practices and figuring out whether or not they're lawful under the Sherman Antitrust Act and other pieces of legislation. It is the federal government offering scrutiny to businesses and trusts to see whether they're following the law or see whether they're exploiting the market, exploiting monopolies, exploiting the workers. It's a really big deal. Later in the Progressive Era, you get two constitutional amendments. The 18th Amendment, which is banning of alcohol. So this starts the Prohibition era. So it starts the Prohibition era, where the United States bans alcohol. Remember, temperance reformers were a major part of the progressive movement. But the 19th Amendment is much more consequential because the 19th Amendment is giving women the right to vote. It is giving women the right to vote and therefore enabling half of society to have the ability to vote for all public offices in the country. This is a big deal. It's not just a major goal for first wave feminism, but it is that. But it's also changing the political dynamics of the country because suddenly politicians have to care what women think about major issues because they have to get votes from women. No one before 1920 had to care at the federal level about what women thought about major issues. Like, for instance, World War I, which was over by the time the 19th Amendment passed. But no one had to care how women felt about the war because they weren't going to be voting. No one had to care about what women thought about child labor because they weren't voting. This doesn't just double the voting population of the United States. It changes political discourse. Now, it won't be evident immediately, but as you get deeper into the 20th century, right, politicians have to address the concerns of women. Not that women are a unified, monolithic block of voters. They certainly aren't. Women's experiences vary depending on socioeconomic status, race, ethnicity, culture, work, education, region of the country you live in, so on and so forth. But now you have to care. So these are the big national reforms. They are hugely consequential, and we'll be talking about them for the rest of the class. In Washington, Washington is an enthusiastic participant in the progressive reform movement. And they also didn't think that the national reforms went far enough, so there's Washington-specific reforms that emerge. In 1907, we get open primaries. Today in this country, we have two kinds of elections, primary elections and general elections. A primary election is an election within a political party. So before primary elections emerge across the country, and Washington is one of the first places to have them, basically candidates got on a ballot. So a candidate for an office, be it Congress, the governor, the presidency, whatever, they got on a ballot because they were chosen by party leaders. Party leaders got together and said, we want this person to be on there. And then we want this person to be on there. So that's who would be voted on the general election, which meant that these party leaders were very, very powerful and open to bribes. So let's say that you wanted candidates who would work for the people and not big government or like big business, right? Well, your choices might be limited if big businesses went on there and bribed each of the political parties to get the candidates that they wanted on the ballot, then your choice didn't really mean anything. And so Washingtonians considered the solution to this to be primaries, that political parties should open up elections to their members to elect for who should be the candidate to go forward to the general election where the general public would vote on it. This was seen as a way to combat political corruption. And in some cases, it was very effective at that. But as you get deeper in the 20th and into the 21st century, this has consequences that we'll talk about a little bit later. But this was an anti-corruption measure. The belief in the early 20th century was that the solution to the problems affecting democracy was more democracy. If you make society more democratic, you will make it more transparent and less corrupt. We'll talk about whether that is actually true in every instance a little bit later on. Washington granted women suffrage earlier, 10 years before it was granted at a national level. So in 1910, women got the right to vote in Washington. Now, they could only vote in state and local elections. They were not allowed to vote in federal elections because that simply wasn't allowed. But they could vote in state and local elections a full decade before they could in national elections. One of the biggest things, reforms that developed in the Pacific Northwest that then spread to the rest of the country was the initiative referendum and recall system, which Washington adopts in 1911. It's often called nationally the Oregon system because it developed first in Oregon, but Washington's an early adopter of it. And the Pacific Northwest as a whole is a pioneer of this. What this is direct democracy. Remember my statement a little bit earlier, the solutions to corruption are more democracy. So the initiative, referendum, and recall system are direct democracy. For the most part, democracy in the United States works as representative democracy. We vote for representatives who then make decisions on our behalf, and when they run for re-election, if they do, we get to say we liked your decisions or we didn't like your decisions. But we do that through referendums on them, through elections on them. We don't rarely decide things directly. But in Washington, there was a sense that this should happen. So we developed initiatives, referendums, and recalls. There are 3 different types of direct democracy. So an initiative is basically when people present a law to the general public, and if it's approved, it becomes law. It's not going through the traditional channel of the state legislature and then to the governor for signature. It's not going through that traditional channel. Someone is basically saying, this is a law I think the state of Washington needs, and presenting it to the people. Now, there's a process for getting that law on the ballot. There's a whole thing that is involved, but the nutshell version is this is direct democracy. People decide directly. A referendum is a similar kind of thing, but usually what it is basically people are giving voice to, or either approving or rejecting measures passed by the state legislature. State legislature saying, hey, we did this. Here you go, people. Decide whether you want it or not. So it's direct democracy, but working through the state legislature. The recall system is actually very, very interesting. So the recall system is basically where if you don't think a political office holder is doing their job correctly, whether they're a local council member, a senator, a governor, whatever, you can start a recall petition. And if it's successful, you can vote to recall them, to remove them from office before the next election. So this is basically bypassing the electoral system and saying, we want this person out now. This is direct democracy. It really begins in the Pacific Northwest and then is exported to the rest of the country. Now, not everywhere in the country now has this system, but many places do. It's a desire by Washingtonians to reform public service and to end government corruption, so therefore they can get policies they want, like workers' compensation in 1911. Washington is one of the earliest states to have a workers' compensation system for injured, disabled, or the families of workers who died. Washington will also make the movements towards having a public education system paid for by tax dollars. Once again, something that they wanted. Washington will embrace prohibition 5 years before the nation does. There's also government efforts to improve medical care, government efforts to improve and alleviate urban poverty. So Washington is a fervent supporter of the Progressive Era and its reforms, but they're also a state that doesn't think some of these reforms went far enough and is doing their own progressive reforms at a state and local level. All right. I know that was a very long lecture. I thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you again soon. Bye for now.